Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 320. This week the questions are taken from guide 394 on the never completed carrier USS United States, the Wednesday video on U-505, the captured submarine on display in Chicago, and the Friday video on frigate duels of the War of 1812 covering the battle between Constitution, Cyan and Levant. So let's begin. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, given the constantly changing nature of large capital ships even while under construction, as seen with examples like USS North Carolina, just how likely would it be that the USS United States would finish up as a more conventional carrier, much like how she appears in World of Warships, before she had even been launched? I think by the time she's under construction, which of course she just about was, given that the submarine launch ballistic missile, which would be the primary naval option for nuclear strike in the rest of the Cold War, wasn't really going to come into service for another decade, and of course in the early 50s, well, technically very late 40s - early 50s, they don't know that's going to be a thing yet. I suspect the United States probably would have been completed with at least an initial nuclear long-range bomber strike capability, albeit probably using something like converted Neptunes and so forth. By the time she's actually completed, bear in mind she's laid down in 49, so let's say that she launches in late 51, early 52, and is completed and worked up in 55. By that point, studies into submarine launched ballistic missiles are probably going to be a thing. At which stage I think she'll probably see out the 50s as her intended role of partially fighter, partially nuclear bomber carrier. But I rather suspect that by the time the submarine-launched ballistic missile subs start coming into service in the early 1960s, which will be roughly commensurate with when she's due for her first major refit, at that point, they will probably repurpose her, because trying to maintain and argue budgets for both nuclear bomber carrying aircraft carriers and nuclear missile armed submarines is going to be rather difficult. And since obviously the ballistic missile armed submarine is a considerably more survivable and less obvious platform, then assuming that something like the Forestals and Kitty Hawks is still under construction as the attack carrier, as opposed to this being the bomber carrier, then she'll probably be refitted over the very early 1960s with her bomber capability not necessarily removed totally, but the bombers themselves removed, and then she'd be stocked up with fighters and more conventional strike aircraft. At which point her slightly odd layout with the 4 separate catapults, including 2 right aft as well as 2 forward, might come in handy, and I can see her perhaps being repurposed as a dedicated fighter carrier, for instance, for the US fleet, because there's not going to be a huge amount of commonality with the other super carriers, but with that very widely spread rapid launch capability, they might say, oh, okay, well, look, we'll have a more balanced air group on all the other carriers, but on this particular carrier, we're just going to stuff her full of fighters and essentially use her as combat air patrol and maintenance. And of course, as time goes on and fighters evolve into fighter bombers, then she'd gain a strike capability, or perhaps regain a strike capability once more. Warrant Officer Will asks, assuming that USS United States is either completed or quickly refitted after a short period of time into a more conventional design, how long would her class's likely service life be, assuming it isn't cut short as a sacrificial lamb for future nuke boats like some of the Essexes? Well, building on what we just discussed in the previous question, if she is refitted, let's say in the early 60s, to be a more conventional carrier, she is going to be somewhat larger in displacement and a little bit longer than the Forestals and the Kitty Hawks, if we're assuming that the Forestals and Kitty Hawks are still going to be built pretty much to their historical design spec. Now, whilst, as I said, with her somewhat unusual layout with a double-angled deck, she'd make a very good rapid launch aircraft for fighters, and thus, as the fighter protection ship for the rest of the fleet, she'd be a pretty good bet. As time goes on, as again we mentioned in the previous question, she would likely acquire or reacquire a strike capability as aircraft like the F-4 Phantom come in, which can obviously do bombing as well as fighter duties. And her sheer size, especially any hangar that was originally designed to accommodate bombers, will give her a somewhat greater capability to operate large aircraft as you go on into the nuclear-powered carrier age, as compared to something like Midway or even the Forestals and Kitty Hawks. At which point, given that Midway managed to make it all the way through to the end of the Cold War, and some of the other conventionally powered carriers made it even further, I suspect that the USS United States, assuming she doesn't have any major issues with maintenance and machinery, will probably make it through to the early 2000s, possibly even the late 2000s, because of her slightly larger flight group capability and her ability to accommodate rather large aircraft. The main thing which might count against her would be, of course, the fact that she'd be substantially older than any of the other big US carriers except for Midway, which would mean that there's a possibility that she might suffer significant machinery degradation at some point in the late 90s or early 2000s that might just compel her to be retired. The really interesting thing, of course, would be as and when she is decommissioned, there may well be a little bit of a fight in terms of working out whether Midway or United States should become the museum carrier, or the big museum carrier, because obviously there's the Essex-class museum carriers. But of course, Midway these days lives over in San Diego, but there's a possibility that United States might take her place. You never know. C. Babylon asks, not trying to get you out of your comfort zone with the years that you cover, but what were some of the post-World War II designs from countries like France and other Allied nations? Are you planning on covering any of those? The vast majority of warships entering service immediately after World War II, unless you're the Soviets, tended to be, here's a bunch of surplus American stuff, or here's a bunch of stuff we were already building either before or during World War II, now you get a chance to complete it. So that kind of stuff I would happily cover. Stuff like the Jean Bart in her completed form, somewhat different in design to Richelieu, for example, or the French complete redesign of some of their partially built pre-World War II light cruisers into, massive anti-aircraft vessels. But my general rule of thumb is, as I've said before, cut off of the channel at 1950. But to get into a little bit more detail, essentially the ship has to be at the absolute minimum design complete and ready to go in 1950. It doesn't necessarily mean they have to be in service or even that they've actually laid them down yet, but the design has to be complete. And partly because 1950 makes a nice cut-off date to avoid the politics and so forth that I've mentioned previously on the channel, which is something I want to avoid with the later era vessels, but also ships that are designed up to around about 1950 tend to be either entirely or primarily still gun-armed. Although some of them will obviously later be completed or refitted with missile technology, it tends to be a relatively minor subset of their overall specification, whereas once you start to get much past 1950, suddenly missiles become a very significant or even primary part of a ship's armament. And again, as I've mentioned on the channel before, although I understand a reasonable amount about ships and their missiles, their surface-to-air missiles, things like Terrier, Tartar, Talos, Sea Cat, Sea Dart, obviously Sea Dart being a bit later, Sea Slug, the hilarity that is, and so forth. I don't know anywhere near as much as I do about ships' guns. So it serves as a very useful cutoff in that respect. So there's a whole slew of, I think, about half a dozen frigate classes of the Royal Navy, some of which are brand new, some of which are rebuilds of wartime emergency flotilla destroyers, which are all entering service, technically speaking, in the 50s, but they are design complete in the 40s, much like the Forrest Shermans. So anything like that will be covered, but if you get to later stuff, like the first missile ships or the missile ship conversions of US heavy cruisers, or like you can see in this picture, the abortive CVA-01 carrier, or the Type 82 frigate, HMS Bristol, or Type 82 destroyer technically, those I won't be covering myself. If there's a subject matter expert who happens to have looked into them in extreme detail and wants to come and talk about them, like we had for the Type 82, then they are, of course, welcome to drop me a line, and we'll see what we can do about that. But that's kind of the cutoff. So yes, there will be a few ships that look a little bit more modern coming to the channel eventually, but they're still going to be primarily gunships. Wildcard asks, can you tell us more about the time that HMS Unicorn bombarded ground targets in North Korea with her own guns? How close to the shore was she? Did the guns hit their targets? And was she in danger of return fire? So as far as the report goes, Unicorn was conducting her more normal service of delivering things to Allied troops in Korea when it was pointed out that there was some North Korean, essentially their version of coast watchers, further up the coast watching the deliveries at a place called Chopeki Point. Now, of course, as coast watchers, they didn't really have all that much in terms of firepower, so she wasn't in immediate danger of return fire. But of course, their entire objective, the coast watchers that is, was to work out what the Allies were delivering, where and when, and then report back so that something that could do a lot more harm could be called in. Although what exactly that was going to be, whether that was going to be artillery, airstrikes, or something else, it's never made entirely clear. But yeah, they had the ambition at least. Now, with them having been spotted, but the Allied troops who were offloading and receiving supplies not really having the equipment to go after them, Unicorn's captain decided, well, I could go after them, and he declared his intention to do so. And at some point between him doing so and raising steam and heading off in the direction of the unfortunate North Koreans, somebody decided, well, we can't dissuade him from using his carrier as a gigantic shore bombardment platform, but we should probably escort him in case the North Koreans show up with some kind of surface asset, presumably on the basis that they'd forgotten that Unicorn has guns on both sides and therefore probably would have blown a North Korean gunboat out of the water quite happily as well. Nonetheless, the escort was made up of the destroyers Comus and Cossack, so they headed off with Unicorn. They rocked up to within pretty close range, a couple of miles of the coast, sighted in on the North Korean spotters, and Unicorn let fly with, according to the reports, 16 salvos, of which 3 were observed to land on target. Which, given that you're talking about a bombardment by multiple 4-inch or 105mm guns on a bunch of, well, light infantry with binoculars and rifles, I can't imagine there was an awful lot of them left afterwards. Laminat asks, what were, in your opinion, the best naval use cases for unguided rocket projectiles in the period the channel covers? In terms of the uses they actually undertook, then I think, as pictured here, loading a bunch of rockets onto a landing craft and then salvoing them en masse at ground targets was probably the single best use of unguided rockets from a ship, because the other major attempted use of them was as anti-aircraft projectiles, which, yeah, that really didn't work out very well at all. However, there is a potential use case that wasn't explored, mainly because the rocket launcher systems had been discarded before it became a viable thing. And that is looking at stuff like the British 7-inch unrotated projectile launchers, the big boxy things you see on some early war British capital ships. In and of themselves, with the idea of aerial mines, they're pretty useless. However, if they were still around towards the end of the war, I can see there potentially being a rather nice use case for them, because what you would do is set them up on an automatically tracking mounting, a powered mounting, much like they did with the Bofors 40mm on some ships, tie into your fire control system. Now, you would need a separate setting on the fire control system, and it would need to be a radar guided one for all of this to work, but it could be made to. It's not beyond the realm of men in that period to develop this fairly quickly. And then what you do is you stick a proximity fuse on the end of the rocket, and instead of having a mine and all of this kind of stuff, you just have the rocket, the propellant, and a really big warhead. Because it's a 7-inch rocket, it can carry quite a big bit of boom, and obviously a bunch of shrapnel as well. And the idea would be essentially that you're using it like essentially a semi-unguided. I say semi-unguided not because it has any active guidance, but because you're still using a proximity fuse and pointing it using radar-directed fire control. So a semi-unguided point defense system, because that 7-inch warhead with all the anti-aircraft explosive behind it, that could project quite a lethal cone of fragmentation, at which point it would make potentially a rather useful point defense for anti-kamikaze work, because the kamikazes will tend to be coming almost, if not directly, at you, which is going to rather decomplicate your fire control solution. And the 5-inch guns, or 4.5-inch guns, or 4.7, or whatever your heavy AA guns are, at that close range are going to be rather difficult to make track. Whereas, although the UP rocket launcher is of itself a relatively heavy thing, it's nowhere near as heavy as a twin heavy anti-aircraft mount. And of course, it can be nearly entirely automated. And so, rather than just having to rely on 20mm Oerlikons or 40mm Bofors, you could potentially either use them in single launch mode or just ripple fire a bunch of them and essentially annihilate an incoming kamikaze at relatively close range. Now, what the success rate of that would be, okay, it's a little bit questionable, but ultimately obliterating a kamikaze at a few hundred meters, or up to 1,000 yards or so, before it can hit a ship would probably be quite a big cost saving, even if you have to undertake the weight of carrying the thing in the first place, and you might have to go through several dozen rockets before you get a hit, compared to at minimum there's a massive fire on our deck. If you're a carrier, that's, I think, still worth it. BK Zhong asks, between U-47's Scapa Flow raid, I-19's multi-kill, Ventura's underwater sub-on-sub kill, Luigi Torelli's insane I'm going to fight for all three Axis navies track record, and USS Barb's invasion of Japan, which do you think was the most daring submarine feat? And also, why are crazy submarine stories at least as common as crazy destroyer stories? Well, submarine commanders and destroyer commanders tend to share a couple of traits. Firstly, they tend to be a little bit younger, which generally tends to go with a little bit more recklessness, but also they are, generally speaking, selected specifically for recklessness, because usually you want your destroyers and your submarines to be really aggressive and force confrontations, whereas you want your cruiser and carrier and battleship captains, for example, to still have aggression, but to perhaps be a little bit more placid and calculating about things. Whereas the ships that are almost entirely focused on destroying the enemy at almost all costs, that's where you put the attack dogs, if you like, of your fleet. And so the submarines obviously end up with some very aggressive captains. Plus, of course, with a destroyer might go after enemy shipping, but it might also spend a lot of time doing escort work, either for convoys or for other warships, and so on and so forth. And so, statistically speaking, submarines are probably the class of warship which spends the most time of its active deployment time, either in contact with the enemy or actively seeking the enemy, and often in enemy-held waters, and thus the chances of running into the enemy increase, and therefore, statistically speaking, you're going to get a lot of crazy submarine stories out of it. Now, in terms of what is the most daring submarine feat, there are lots of ways of quantifying that, of course. Some of the stuff that you listed is quite remarkable, but my personal way of assigning daring would be a combination of how risky was this, and if I was a submarine commander and given a mission and told, right, you have to do X, how would I feel about doing it? Would I feel, oh, okay, yeah, that should be relatively easy in theory? Would I feel, oh, that's a bit challenging, but, I think I can see myself doing this? Or would I think, I'm not sure I'm coming back from that one? The latter, of course, therefore being the daring element of it. So U-47 Scapa Flow Raid. Very ingenious, very clever, potentially quite nerve-wracking, but something I think that could be planned. I-19's multi-kill. Very daring shot in and of itself, but ultimately it is a mission that the sub is designed to do. It has found an enemy target, it fires a salvo at the enemy target. It doesn't necessarily mean to kill multiple enemy ships, although that's a nice bonus. Happens to, but there's a certain element of luck involved there. Venturer's underwater sub-on-sub kill, that displays a huge amount of ingenuity, especially because, unlike U-47 Scapa Flow Raid, you're thinking pretty much on the fly, and there is a risk, of course, in theory, of the opponent doing what you're trying to do to them right back to you in the middle of the chase. So that would be a relatively high-scoring one. Poor old Luigi Torelli's ending up under the flag of all three Axis navies is partially happenstance, although it is, again, remarkable. Bob's invasion of Japan, single ship invasion, that is, again, quite an example of courage and daring, slightly mitigated by the fact that at the time Bob actually did it, towards the end of the war, I mean, it's not to reduce the courage of the men who did it, but it's much more likely to be successful at that point than if, say, Bob had decided to do it in 1942 or early 1943. But for me personally, I think the most daring, as in, okay, somebody did this, someone came up with this plan largely on the fly and went through with it anyway, despite the rather obvious risks, and somehow pulled it off, I think probably has to go to a US submarine. I forget exactly what the exact name of the sub was at this exact moment, but it is a sub I've covered in the US Pacific Submarine Campaign videos, I'm pretty sure. And this particular submarine found itself with a relatively heavily escorted Japanese convoy to try and go after, and decided that the best approach for this was to wait for nightfall. That's a fairly standard tactic. But once night had fallen, rather than try and pick off escorts or outlying elements of the enemy force, they decided instead they were going to surface in the middle of the convoy, firing forward and aft tubes with almost wild abandon, and reloading and firing as fast as possible with pretty much every weapon they could bring to bear, essentially trying to do a multi-shot 360 no-scope inside of the target, on the approximate understanding that because it's in the middle of the convoy, initially the escorts will be very confused, and then the escorts will find it a little bit difficult to find them, and once they have found them, the escorts will be hesitant to fire because they're in the middle of the convoy, and the chance of friendly fire in the crossfire is very, very high. And to cap it all off, proceeding through the convoy at high speed, still shooting off everything it can get its hands on, thus causing huge amounts of confusion, casualties, and making it out, because pretty much the entire thing paid off as you'd expect, despite obviously the risks of being shot up at point-blank range by an escort who was a little bit more free with their firing, or being rammed, or any number of other things. You know, surface attack where you deliberately draw attention to yourself in the middle of a convoy by a submarine is usually a one-way ticket to Davy Jones' locker. The fact that this was a plan that they came up with, as I said, pretty much on the fly and executed with near perfect precision, to me is, if not the very pinnacle, at least a very strong contender for pinnacle of most daring submarine feat. Other things would probably be more along the lines of the special forces type operations with midget subs, because again, those, although not quite as immediately adrenaline inducing, are incredibly high risk operations with, relatively speaking, primitive equipment, which usually tend to work out somewhat for the best, rather improbably. Josh Thomas Moore asks, there are many famous and infamous mercenaries throughout history, but I haven't seen any naval mercenaries. Given it's the second oldest profession, I would have thought that some tried to do it at least once. Have there ever been naval mercenaries or mercenary bands? There certainly were people that and organisations that you could class as naval mercenaries, but they tend to have other terminology behind them. So, for example, privateers, which are private individuals with a charter from a specific government to go out and shoot up and capture ships of another government or any government except for a whitelist, if you like, are effectively mercenaries, especially because a number of privateers would not just fight for the country that they are from, they'd also fight for other countries, either just because that other country would pay them or because that other country still had issues with a particular lot of people that the privateer in question really wanted to have a go at, and maybe their home country was at peace at that stage. Pirates would sometimes hire themselves out to specific individuals or specific nations, or would come up with deals where they wouldn't target specific nations or individuals but would continue their piratical activities elsewhere. The Barbary Pirates being a good example, which, depending on exactly how close the relationship was with the people who were paying them, may or may not constitute being mercenaries. In ancient times, there were a small number of actual full-on mercenary naval groups, i.e. people who had warships who would just show up and like, you pay us, we'll fight for you. You don't pay us, we might go and fight against you if someone else wants to pay us. But as compared to something like the White Company and various other freelancers in medieval Europe, the single biggest problem with being a naval mercenary in the strictest sense is that a land-based mercenary group will tend to get paid a bunch and also loot a bunch, and when there's not an active conflict, they can provide for themselves to a certain degree until they run out of money. Then they have to look for a new set of people to terrorize or to pay to not terrorize them. Whereas if you are at sea, one, there's a much more limited number of places you can actually just go when you're not actively fighting somebody. In terms of, there's only so many ports, and those ports tend to be controlled by people who may or may not like you. But also, ships cost a lot more to maintain, and crews cost a lot more to pay and provision as compared to your average land-based mercenary, because your average land-based mercenary, as I say, you'd pay them during the campaign, you'd pay them in loot, and then when there's not a conflict going on, you might pay them a general stipend, but they generally look after themselves. Whereas to keep your crew together on a ship, you have to pay them pretty much full time, and you still have to pay to maintain the ship, and so on and so forth. And considering that there's not a near continuous series of sea-based warfare at any particular point in history, like there was in, say, Central and Western Europe in the 1300s and 1400s, it means you're going to have to be somewhat selective in your targets just in order to have somewhere to actually go into port occasionally, and that's going to further break things up because various nations don't want naval mercenaries operating out of their ports and antagonizing other nations, even if they're doing it on behalf of still other nations, because that will antagonize the nation that's being attacked when the nation in question wants to be at peace. So, for example, if you were a naval mercenary in theory in the 1400s or 1500s, You couldn't necessarily base yourself out of a French port to attack Spanish shipping on behalf of the English, because the French wouldn't want the Spanish to be annoyed with them, at least at certain points. Other times they might not care. So how do you support yourself? Well, you could either do trade, or you could become a pirate, at which point you are a pirate who occasionally does privateering. So I think the overall point of that is privateering is about as close as you're going to come to full-on naval mercenary type activity. However, there is also a separate side issue, which kind of sidesteps the whole needing to keep a crew and ship in pay all the time, which is that you can have individuals or small groups of individuals who might go around offering their services to various countries to fight for them against somebody else because they don't have anything better to do. Now, in that case, it becomes a little bit of more of a grey area because, for example, Admiral Cochrane, and you'll find a lot of British naval officers did this, especially in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. If Admiral Cochrane goes off to fight for a South American navy, does he count as a mercenary? He is technically a foreigner acting in a private capacity, now fighting a conflict which his home nation is not a part of on behalf of a third party. So technically, looking at it that way, he is a mercenary. On the other hand, he is actually fully employed and given rank in somebody else's navy. Is a foreigner serving in another navy a mercenary, or are they just someone who happens to be in that navy who happens to be of foreign origin? Well, in that case, technically, probably not, at least legally speaking. So he's not a mercenary, even though he is conducting mercenary-like activities. But this kind of thing is subject to a lot of very fine minutiae of legal discussion, so I'll leave it up to you to decide exactly what line those kind of people sit on. But yeah, generally speaking, yes, there are naval mercenaries and mercenary groups, but they tend to be called other things or have legal grey areas which determine whether or not they were or were not technically mercenaries. Yamashiro Kai asks, the Akagi and Kaga originally had multi-flight deck plans when completed, but later were refitted to have a single flight deck. Were there any plans to do something similar to the ships of the Courageous class, and if not, what design changes could the Royal Navy have done in a hypothetical refit to those ships? I don't believe there were any serious plans to do such a refit to Courageous and Glorious, mostly because they were really nowhere near as useful as Akagi and Kaga, for a variety of reasons. I mean, they're physically smaller, but also being built as rather lightweight, large light cruisers, they didn't have anywhere near the defensive capabilities either, and there was no real point in trying to add those in. Plus, of course, they were, relatively speaking, older hulls and older ships, so while they were very useful to the Royal Navy, especially in terms of learning how to operate multiple carriers and essentially being experimental test beds, the impression I get looking at Royal Navy documentation is that in the late 1930s, they are far more focused on building new carriers with considerably greater protective capabilities, and that had war not broken out, Courageous and Glorious and Furious and Argus and Eagle and Hermes would have soon been replaced by much larger and much better carriers, at which point there was relatively little point in spending large amounts of money in taking these older carriers offline for a decent chunk of what was supposed to be their final years, and then turning them out in a somewhat more capable format, only to decommission them again a few years later on down the line. Whereas, comparatively speaking, Akagi and Kaga had very much larger, more useful air groups, greater defensive capability, and with their refits became pretty capable and would likely have stayed in service for considerably longer had, Midway not occurred. But, in theory, if you did want to do that kind of refit, let's say, again, the Treasury opens the purse strings a little bit more, and the British take a look at what the Japanese have done with Akagi and Kaga and go, I think we might want to do this ourselves, perhaps with the work starting in 1932, 33, something like that, so that it's mostly done by the time the historic refits of the battleships and battle cruisers start to come about, then I think the single biggest design change would be very similar to what the Japanese did. So extending the hangar deck further forward considerably, possibly slightly further aft as well, to give you a greater aircraft carrying capacity. I'd also plate in the bows to give it, a proper hurricane bow, and you can maybe put some stores there and so forth. Now, the other thing you're definitely going to need to do is replace the elevators, so bigger, more powerful elevators for bigger, more powerful aircraft. The big question, I think, on my mind would be what to do about the hangars, because the hangars are 16 foot tall. Now, that's not necessarily quite as tall as some American ships, but it is a little bit taller than some of the hangar heights in some British carriers. So accommodating clipped wing Corsairs or Avengers with a radio mast folded down would be possible. And although it's very tempting to say, well, you know what, while we're redoing the elevators, probably redoing the flight deck, extending the hangar, why don't we just cut everything down slightly and have one massive internal hangar with, you're essentially saving weight by lowering the overall height of the flight deck, but having maybe a 20-foot hangar. The thing is, that's going to halve your internal hangar space. And bear in mind, the British don't do deck parking at this stage. So, although it's very tempting to go with a one big hangar approach, given that these ships are likely to be decommissioned at the end of the Second World War historically, if they survived, or if you're looking in the early 1930s, you'd perhaps be thinking about decommissioning them in the early to mid-40s anyway. I think I would probably argue against having to cut the double hangar into a single one, unless it was absolutely necessary to save weight so that you could add weight to extend the now single unified hangar right fore and right aft with a significant bow and stern over projection for the flight decks. In that case, fine, it's justifiable, and you'd get a pretty nice carrying capacity with huge amounts of space for pretty much any aircraft. But with a pair of 16-foot high hangars, I think as long as you can justify it in terms of weight and stability, I'd be tempted to keep them. Or, maybe go for some kind of weird hybrid in between where, let's say, a third or half of the new hangar length is double height, with the upper section maybe being fighter storage only and the lower section being a workshop for the repair and maintenance of aircraft, and then the rest of the hangar being a single height hangar. That might buy you enough weight to justify extending the whole thing over the full length of the ship's hull, plus obviously it would give you absolutely colossal storage space in your, at that point, 32-foot high hangar. You could definitely hang entire aircraft off of the ceiling at that point. Or if you didn't want a 32-foot high ceiling, maybe have, again, maybe a smaller area, a quarter or a third of the hangar space double heighted, but drop the lower hangar level right down to maybe 12 or 14 feet, and it's purely a workshop for parts rather than hauling in entire aircraft. You still have your fighters stored in a 16-foot hangar above, and then that allows you to cut down the overall height of the flight deck. So, you're still, even if you cut it down to 12 feet, you're still going to have a 28-foot hangar forward, which is still more than enough to store practically anything. It's all a matter at that point of structural calculations and making sure that such a tall hangar can actually be supported. Vicky asks, in the age of sail, and even into the early portion of the ironclad age, sailing one's fleet into the opposing fleet and breaking their line, accepting that this would mean allowing your own T to be crossed in turn, was a battle-winning tactic that could be devastatingly effective. 4 Days Battle, Battle of the Saints, Trafalgar, Lissa, etc. By the 20th century, however, sailing into an enemy battle line and allowing your T to be crossed had become a near surefire way to get your own fleet shredded, unless you could rapidly and cleanly disengage, like Tsushima, Jutland, Surigao Strait as various examples of the different scenarios. When did breaking the line cease to be a viable fleet battle tactic? I think there may be a little bit of wobbling back and forth into the late 19th century as technological advances probably mean it becomes viable, then not viable, then viable again over the span of a handful of years. But broadly, I would say the two biggest advancements that make breaking the line a non-viable tactic would be the deployment of reliable and reasonable range torpedoes towards the end of the 19th century, whether they be onboard battleships or torpedo boats or whatever, because the whole point of breaking the line involves you charging down into the enemy line at close range, essentially the bargain being that you will take less damage than you can inflict on your enemy once you break that line. Now, under the paradigm of 19th century ironclad warfare, that remains viable for a while because the rate of fire and range of ironclad guns is still fairly short range, and especially towards the end when they start mounting 13.5, 16.75, 17-inch guns, etc., the rate of fire is hilariously slow. So crossing from maximum possible range to I'm breaking through your line and can now broadside you range, your opponent might only get off a couple of salvos, and the chances of them hitting you are relatively slim unless they hold their fire right up until the very last moment. Now, as the guns get really big and explosive shells become really powerful, perhaps roughly commensurate actually with the outlay of torpedoes, then it starts to die off in viability, because if you can get half your guns to bear, the enemy can get their full broadside to bear, and if at say 200, 300 yards, they can pretty much guarantee to put their entire heavy salvo of armor-piercing shells both on you and through your armor, then that's going to do devastating damage in much the same way that at that kind of range a torpedo salvo might do devastating damage, and therefore stop you dead in your tracks before you can regain the advantage of having split the enemy line and now broadside them. So that would be one point where you could argue that breaking the line has ceased to be a viable battle tactic, so that would be maybe in the 1880s. However, you could simultaneously make the argument that if you are trying to break the line in company with your own destroyers, torpedo boats, whatever, that might mitigate things slightly, because it's going to distract the fire of the enemy capital ships, because your escort's torpedoes are a threat to them. And especially if you have torpedo boat destroyers or full-on destroyers, you can potentially take the fight to the enemy fast attack craft as well, which might buy you enough time to cross that relatively short distance from main battery accurate firing range to breaking the line. But then the ultimate death knell, I mean, it's still a sketchy argument, but the ultimate death knell for breaking the line pretty much comes about at the end of the 19th century, because at that point you start to get longer guns with different propellant and range finders as well, which suddenly means you can engage at 3, 5, 10,000 yards, etc. And suddenly you've got to cross a huge amount of distance, potentially under enemy fire, whereas up until, say, the 1890s, you probably didn't have to cross a hugely greater distance than Nelson had to cross at Trafalgar whilst under enemy fire, and you were now able to move considerably faster, and the enemy was actually probably firing somewhat slower, albeit with more effective shells. But once battle ranges start to go up past 3,000 or 4,000 yards, now you have a very long period of time where you're going to be under fire, and commensurately also you have the advent of quick firing guns. Both small caliber and the big guns go from rates of minutes per round to rounds per minute, albeit not many rounds per minute, but still. Now you're going to be under fire for a long time, and those more powerful guns potentially going to punch through any armor that you're reasonably carrying at, several thousand yards, which now means you're at risk of being severely crippled for a long period of time before you breach the enemy line. So there's kind of two stages. There's a mostly invalid as a tactic in probably the 1880s, and definitely invalid as a tactic by the 1900s. At least assuming a conventional set of fleets fighting a similar engagement. The one-man Kiyoshi Kakawa fan club asks, the tendency of the Imperial Japanese Navy to falsely claim that various American ships were sunk during the Pacific War, leading to the ships in question being nicknamed as ghosts, is rather notorious nowadays. However, given the fact that the Americans avoided this tendency by decrypting Japanese radio communications, what Japanese ships could have been considered ghosts without the help of these intercepts? Well, any number of ships in 1942 and early 43, thanks to the hilariously malfunctioning Mark 14, because if you weren't going by the radio intercepts, a lot of the submarine crews would go, well, we fired a bunch of torpedoes, we heard a bunch of explosions, we even potentially saw a bunch of hits, so surely this ship would have sunk. And, the number of those ships would be far too numerous to list, I think. But in larger terms, the Congos, being the most actively used Japanese capital ships apart from carriers, did tend to come under submarine attack relatively often. So potentially some of those might have been claimed as sunk and announced as such if it wasn't able to be followed up that actually they either were missed or the torpedo didn't work properly or they were damaged and heading back home, etc. There's a few Japanese cruisers as well that fall into that category, albeit that a good chunk of the Japanese cruisers that survived being torpedoed did tend to have fairly extensive dock times. So while they may not necessarily be sunk, they may be out of action for a long period of time or potentially for the rest of the war. A couple of Japanese cruisers in Singapore being a good example of that. But I think possibly the ships that would end up being the most ghost-like, if you like, under this paradigm would probably be Hio and Junyo, not only because they were torpedoed a few times or had torpedoes shot at them considerably more than that, but also because of their slightly odd status as converted liners and kind of being in an interim overall size and shape and layout, very often when something wasn't entirely clear, even to US Intel at the time, you would end up with these ships being essentially the default, we shot at a carrier-shaped object, it must be one of these type of things, which wasn't helped by the fact that for a long period in the war, the US had completely the wrong names for them. They misread the Japanese characters and thought they were Hayatake class rather than Hio class. So, for example, when you see various attacks on some of the later Japanese carriers, the Unryus and so forth, you will sometimes see them being designated as attack on a Hayatake class carrier, which of course doesn't exist. It means a Hio class carrier. And at that point, given that obviously they were attacked, as I said, a few times and survived, and other ships were often misidentified as them, the Hio and Junyo would probably be this without intel support, the ships most claimed as sunk and actually not having been sunk, either because they'd survived or because another ship that looked like them had been sunk. Reichspeer Minister asks, what is or was the largest cast piece of metal on a ship, and why was it produced that way? And what is or was the upper limit, and could a ship's hull be made fully by casting it, and would that be the largest ever bathtub? The single largest cast item aboard a ship is usually going to be the ship's anchor, but in some cases it may be the ship's propeller, depending both on the size of the anchor and also whether the propeller is a single piece item or whether it's made up of a central, essentially, cone with the blades then bolted onto it. Some propellers are like that, some propellers are single piece items. So it's going to be one of those two things. The upper limit, technically speaking, is the upper limit of whatever ingot can be cast and then forged by a steel manufacturer, or in the propeller's case, bronze manufacturer in a given country. So we know from the making of battleship guns that you're talking in the order of 150 to 200 tons per item in at least the 1930s and World War II. But bearing in mind, that's the upper limit of just a single item, a single ingot. If you want to actually turn that into something, you are probably going to lose some weight. Of course, there's also largest in terms of length, and at that point, some element of the keel and perhaps a stern post or stem post might be longer if it doesn't necessarily mass as much as something like the anchor. Now, as far as could you cast an entire ship's hull, technically yes, but it would be a very small ship. It would essentially be a boat at that stage. Would it be physically possible to cast a couple of 100-ton ship hull? I mean, technically physics says that you could, or possibly you could make a casting for a ship's hull that's even larger, in terms of, yes, you could actually physically pour this amount of metal into this absurdly sized mold and get something out of it. However, for one thing, obviously you'd have to drill holes in it to get the propeller shafts through and pumps and intakes and so forth anyway. But secondly, at that kind of size and surface area, you would run into massive problems with differential cooling, and the chances of cracking or warping would be ridiculously high. So practically speaking, if you're talking about a full-on proper ship hull, no, you're not going to cast that as a single piece. Hedden Harley asks, I very much enjoyed the War of 1812 frigate duels series and hope you might cover other frigate duels from the Age of Sail at some point. Yeah, probably will. That thought made me wonder, when did the first frigate duel occur, and when did history's last frigate duel happen? I know the answer depends greatly on how you define a frigate, but how would you answer? If you're looking at the last of what you might term the classical frigates, back when the term was a continuous one as opposed to being resurrected in the Second World War, then I think you could make an argument that the Battle of Angamos in 1879 might be the last frigate duel. The Chileans certainly had armoured frigates present. It largely comes down to how you define Huascar, because she's a turret ship, admittedly, but just having a turret doesn't necessarily make her not a frigate. You have to look at what is the role of a frigate. And you have this weird situation where Huascar is probably the most capable combatant in her navy, which technically would make her a capital ship. But on the flip side, where you compare her to other ironclads, both at the time she's built and at the time she's captured, she is very much a small vessel, but an ocean-going one, nevertheless. And small ocean-going, capable of going into combat, doesn't fare too well against full-size capital ships. That sounds pretty much like a frigate to me. So you could make an argument to a certain degree that Huascar is a turret frigate, an armoured turret frigate, and that she therefore lost out in a frigate duel to a couple of other bigger armoured frigates along more traditional, conventional lines, at least as far as warship design of the time went. As far as first frigate duel, that's a very more difficult one, because you've got the potential origins of frigate coming from the Mediterranean, so there may very well have been duels between lightly built galley-type ships in the Med, which locally may have been referred to as fregata or something similar, but which exact one it is, and do we class them as frigates, and so on and so forth, renders that one difficult. But in terms of ships that are very definitely termed frigates by people of the time and enter combat, then I think probably the first frigate duel in that sense is probably happening either in the 1620s, 1630s in the Dutch wars with the Spanish, or potentially if the Spanish don't have any ships there that you could strictly classify as frigates, although by that point they do have their own version of race-built galleons, then definitively by the First Anglo-Dutch War, because at that point you definitely have ships called frigates on both sides, and they do fight a number of different duels. Although, as I said, depending on which conflict you think is the first use of frigates on both sides officially would depend on which conflict has the first duel between them. Sam Signorelli asks, what might be some examples of ships with short active service lives, but with significant impact even in that short life? Sort of an anti-Vasa. For example, USS Johnston, its first mission is in January 44. It sunk 10 months later in October 44. Samuel B. Roberts has an even shorter life. Its first mission in August 1944, but sunk with Johnston less than 2 months later. And we all know what impact they had at Leyte Gulf. Well, there's quite a few different candidates. A Blucher, as seen here, that being the Hipper-class Blucher, would be a potential candidate. She's in service for an exceptionally short period of time before, of course, she is sunk by Oscarsborg Fortress in Norway. Now, you might think, well, in what way is she impactful? Well, in her sinking, and thus the forced withdrawal of the rest of the German invasion force, well, they come back later on, but there's still a delay. That allows the Norwegian gold reserves and a substantial portion of the Norwegian governmental apparatus and royal family to skedaddle out of Norway, which in turn means that the occupation by Germany doesn't have the actual legitimate governmental figures to use as puppets, and also means that the Free Norwegian forces have considerably more legitimacy, which in turn creates a fairly substantial Free Norwegian Navy, as well as land forces, a degree of air forces, and quite a large number of the Norwegian merchant fleet coming over. So collectively, Blucher getting herself sunk so soon into her life actually lends a huge amount of aid to the Allies. Although it's a slightly longer term service life than some on this list, because obviously Johnston and Samuel B. Roberts would also definitely be on the list, you could potentially argue the carrier USS Hornet. She lasts only a week over a year into commission, but in the time between her commission and her loss at the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, she is responsible directly for, obviously, the Doolittle raid. She's part of the force at Midway. And yes, I know her dive bombers go off on a little bit of a flight to nowhere, but her other aircraft are still very important. And after the flight to nowhere, even her dive bombers remain somewhat important to the conflict. Of course, she actually fights at the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. Obviously, that's why she's lost there. So she has a very active role and is responsible for some fairly famous incidents before she's eventually sunk. I think we should probably, for the sake of argument, exclude U-boats and other submarines, because there's a fair number of subs that are launched, sink something rather spectacular, and then are themselves sunk by anti-submarine forces very shortly thereafter, which would mean they tend to populate this list quite a lot. You could probably actually stick SMS Lutzow, the Derflinger-class battlecruiser, on this list, because she's technically only fully commissioned in March 1916, which means she actually only spends 2 full months in commission, and then a little bit of March and 1 day in June before she's sunk at the Battle of Jutland. But of course, whilst at Jutland, she is directly responsible for the sinking of HMS Invincible, and prior to that, she is part of the force that engages in shore bombardment missions off the British coast, which in part is responsible for drawing the battle cruisers, the British battle cruisers that is, to be based in Rosyth, which in turn potentially leads to some of the issues the British battle cruisers have at Jutland. So potentially a fairly major impact there for a ship that didn't even last out 3 months. And finally for this week, Andre de Coult asks, how many videos on average do you have as work in progress at any one time, i.e. initial research, script writing, script finalizing, recording, post-processing, editing, and final export not counting? And how does this vary during a week and a month respectively? Now, this is a rather interesting one. I wouldn't necessarily say the total number varies on a per week basis all that much. On a per month basis, there is a little bit of a peak and a trough. So on average, I would say there's probably around between a dozen and 2 dozen videos in progress at any one time at some point in their production, between initial research and final editing. The reason that I would say it varies on a per month basis is that usually if I haven't got a lot happening in that month, like travel, where I have to prepare a bunch of videos, obviously, for the time I'm traveling, as well as the more regular ones, I will normally try and have a fairly front-loaded month. So for 5-minute guides, Generally, they're relatively easier to do because obviously there's a relatively small amount of content compared to a Drydock or Wednesday or a Friday video. So I'll try and do those in batches. So at the beginning of the month, there might be 4 to 8 roughly, more videos on the books than normal, because I'll try and do a month's worth of 5-minute guides over the course of a few days, if things are, relatively speaking, easy to research. Sometimes they aren't. So, for example, at the time of recording, I'm working on, amongst other things, a 5-minute guide for the Spanish pre-dreadnought Pelayo, which is going to be actually the last 5-minute guide for 2024. But although I was also working on 5-minute guides for Royal Sovereign and Hoche earlier this week, with Pelayo, I've discovered that there's not a huge amount of information available in English, and what there is tends to either be mutually contradictory or not particularly well sourced. So, as with a number of other videos that I've done over the years, especially the one for the last voyage of the Glorioso, I've actually ordered several books in Spanish that have more extensive information on Pelayo, and while I'm waiting for them to arrive, I have the bare bones of a script for Pelayo, but that video is on hold production-wise until those books arrive, which will hopefully be in the next couple of weeks. I typically also try and maintain 2 or 3 kind of emergency break glass here in the event of emergency scripts, so scripts that I have previously researched, written out, etc., but haven't actually recorded or committed to video format. And the idea is then, if something really dramatic happens, like I get hit by a car or there's a major medical emergency elsewhere, I don't have to worry about the research element, which is the longest element, obviously, for any of these videos. I can just turn around and go, okay, pull the script off the shelf, record it, edit it, up it goes, job done. So there's usually a couple of those that I'll try and maintain and keep updated as time goes on. Obviously, in final production, unless I've done them previously for some reason, there'll usually be 3 videos for each week, sometimes 4 if there's a Friday video as well. Normally those will be in final edit and rendering format, unless, obviously, again, I've got to go overseas or something like that, in which case I'll have rendered and uploaded them several weeks beforehand. And then mainly it's going to be the Patreon Drydock, which I'll do in little segments, and the Wednesday and Friday videos, because I'll typically have 8 to 10 of them on the go at any one time. So again, at time of recording of this particular Drydock, I have the following scripts in some form of production, somewhere between doing initial research all the way through writing and maybe even beginning to record them. I've got a script on the turrets of the Tegethoff class and whether or not they were really that badly ventilated. A script that I've been working on for a while on the Littorio class's armor scheme and why I have a few questions about its effectiveness. A script that might be 2 scripts or 1 on HMAS J9 and HMVS Cerberus, which is obviously partially based on their history and partially based also on the wrecks that are present in Melbourne, which I've got footage of thanks to my trip to Australia. A script on the Battle of Lepanto, which I would say is about 75% there, but I seriously need to start thinking about learning how to use Blender for 3D modeling to show what was going on. A script that's, I would say, is 85% of the way there on Admiral Hawke, which is probably going to end up being split into at least a 2, possibly 3-parter. Another one on the Great Siege of Gibraltar and Gibraltar defences as a whole, which again will probably be a multi-part video. One on the many lies of Billy Mitchell, which is an exceedingly complicated thing that I'm still trying to figure out how to reduce down a little bit. Another one on the history of the Hungarian Navy on the Danube, which again may or may not be a multi-parter. I've got a series of outline scripts for the battles of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the first Anglo-Dutch War, that is, and the Malta convoys, although they're very much on the back burner because I haven't decided which of the 2 I want to make the next ongoing series for some of the Fun Fridays for 2025. There's obviously a whole bunch of stuff that I've pre-recorded on visits to Australia and Scandinavia and the US, which technically could be considered in progress. And I've also got the Pacific Fleet submarine campaign and Pacific Fleet Japanese submarine campaign videos also in current production. I'm basically on both of those actually waiting for new releases of books, which should provide some rather interesting information to add to them. And one that I've been sitting on for several years because I'm constantly refining it and adding more information, because I know there's going to be a lot of people very angry either way when I publish it, which is a rather forensic examination looking at the evidence both for and against whether or not Bismarck was scuttled. Because, well, without any spoilers, there's a lot of argumentation both for and against the idea. And, as I said, it's going to make people angry whichever side I come down on. So I want to make sure that absolutely every possible source and explanation has been looked at within reason. Looking at the combined testimonies of all the Bismarck survivors, the people who were actively sinking the Bismarck, what the wreck shows us, etc., and so on. And to be honest, actually, that's not everything I'm working on, but it's a good chunk of it. And that's it for this video. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, if indeed you have made it to the end of the Drydock here. And I hope I'll see you again in another video soon. Till then, thanks very much and goodbye.